Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Shoupe, and I'm one of your hosts of the Red State Rundown. Just a quick note on today's episode. This is the first episode that we've had to do remotely. Our guest today is Stetson Kornegay, and he currently lives in North Carolina, so obviously we had to do this one remotely. And so we're testing out some new hardware and software. The sound quality, I will go ahead and tell you, is not the best. But I do hope you'll stick around and listen to today's episode because he is a son of Houston County. He's a graduate of Houston Academy, and he talks about his 12 years of experience in the military and some of the things that he's had the pleasure of witnessing and doing on behalf of our nation. We talked about a lot of things in this episode. This is a very wide-ranging interview, probably the most wide-ranging one that we've had so far. We discussed the war in Ukraine. We discussed the war in Israel and how that relates to those of us in Southeast Alabama. We also talked about the changing geopolitical situation in the world, all the instability. We talk about the brutality of war. And if you stick around, we actually talk about UFOs. Stetson has a lot of interesting thoughts about UFOs, or I guess UAPs is what they're called now. So thank you for tuning in today's episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Hello, everyone. This is Brandon Shoupe, and I'm solo hosting Red State Rundown today. Misty was supposed to join me. Something is coming up with her family. Something has come up with her family. Everything's fine, but she is unable to hop on the podcast today. But I'm super excited to have my cousin. I've mentioned him once or twice on the podcast before. I have to be honest with you, I have looked forward to this episode for over a month now. Stetson Kornegay is from Southeast Alabama. Grew up in Houston County. Graduated from Houston Academy. And very interesting person. We've had a lot of interesting conversations over the past several years over Thanksgiving and Christmas. And so I am excited to have him on today. Stetson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm currently attending University of North Carolina because I just exited military service. After military service, I was involved in an entrepreneurial venture with regenerative ranching for a little bit, for about a year. Was gone too much, decided I wanted to be a little bit more stable in terms of my family. And so, made the decision to use the GI Bill, which is a product of serving, to attend University of North Carolina. So I'm getting my MBA. Right now, I'm concentrating in technology and innovation management because, it's an incredibly interesting time to be alive, particularly in the context of where America's headed in the fourth industrial revolution and some of the innovation that's going on in our country that's not going on in the rest of the world. So, yeah, I mean, when we get together, we do have interesting discussions. I've enjoyed, looking and seeing what you post for your podcast. I've enjoyed watching you campaign and, becoming county commissioner. So, I'm excited to be on with you, and hopefully our exuberance in person kind of translates on the podcast too, and people, hopefully find it interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think some people will. Some people have probably already turned off the podcast by now, but you know what? That's fine. But yeah, so talk a little bit about yourself. So, like I said, grew up in Houston County, went to Houston Academy. I can't remember the year that you graduated, but what sort of steered you towards military service?
Yeah, I did go to Houston Academy. I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship into the school. And, I look at that as, all the little academic environments I've been in, either through Auburn or through the military, I still look at Houston Academy as a pivotal moment in my life in terms of uh, helping me get, uh, you know, academically sound education under me in a high school context and then moving forward in the world. I think it was just looking back, it's a fantastic opportunity. Even being in graduate school, I still say, well, I'm still not working as hard as I was at Houston Academy because it was such a tough academic environment. So I joke with people about that. They don't believe me, but it's true. I haven't been back to see Houston Academy in a while, but it was a fantastic school, and I was there. It still is a fantastic school, and I'm a product of that, so I'm proud of it. And uh, my whole dream growing up was to go to West Point. I don't know why or how I got interested in military service. I do remember reading certain military books or biographies pre 9/11. And then, of course, once 9/11 hit, like so many other people, it altered my life path. I committed to joining the military. I was committed to going to West Point. My junior year of high school, I was involved in a horrific car wreck, shattered my femur, really messed up my hip, a lot of other internal injuries. And, West Point basically said, if you want to come here, you're going to have to think about it doing it another year. You'll never be able to pass the DOD medical review board. So you're going to have to talk to us in 2 years. So then I went to Alabama. My body was still recovering. They had granted me an ROTC scholarship based on some academic grades. And then I went there and failed the PT test because I had not recovered yet physically from that car wreck. So then they
That's
pulled my
crazy.
scholarship.
I guess I didn't know that. I mean, I knew you'd been
Yeah,
in an accident, but I didn't know you went through all that stuff.
yeah, they pulled the scholarship. So then I went to Auburn. I didn't tell them I was injured at all. And, I think I was pretty good running academically in terms of academic standing. And then I get there and I barely passed the push-ups. I barely passed the sit-ups. And then it took me 27 minutes to run the 2 miles. So when I finished the 2 miles, the majors at the end of the track were looking at me like, why in the world would you come here so out of shape when that's all you had to
Mm,
do to validate your scholarship?
yeah.
And I said, well, I actually still have a broke leg. And they didn't believe me. And then fortunately for me, they all voted me down to get the scholarship because they didn't think I'd ever be able to handle anything physically with regards to military service.
Wow.
But Auburn had just received a new professor of military science. His name was Colonel Billy Shaw. He was a special forces colonel, fantastic individual, a great mentor. He recently passed away, but he gave me a scholarship on the spot. And I went to Auburn. Of course, once you go to Auburn for 1 year, you're not going to go to West Point because Auburn's too fun. So I enjoyed my time at Auburn, and then I was able to serve 12 years afterwards. And I was in a combat arms. I started off with tanks, so doing heavy maneuver, learning about the platform of the M1 Abrams tank. Those are very fond memories. And then I moved into Light Reconnaissance Command in Hawaii, where I was exposed to a lot of different things.
I
And
remember
then,
that. I
mhm.
remember seeing you post pictures of yourself playing golf. I never figured that
well,
out. I was like, man, they stationed him in Hawaii, and all he does is play golf.
Hawaii is the weather's perfect, so it's like golf year round. So it was a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
place to be stationed. I enjoyed it tremendously, and my wife asked to go back all the time. So maybe one day we'll accommodate that. I don't know, but
yeah, yeah. Well, you better.
and
You better.
yeah, and then I don't know about the live. Like I like living there for 3 years, but at the end of 3 years, it
Oh,
was time to
gotcha.
move on. But
So
she
she
wants to
wants to
live
move
there,
back and stay. I got you. I got
absolutely.
you.
But after my time in Hawaii, the uh, Army, some higher ups in the Army for HRC called me and said, "Are you interested in going to a unit we're standing up at Fort Bragg?" I went and did that, and I was part of a 12-man team. Was the leader of the team as a captain and then a major. We deployed to Afghanistan pre-collapse in about 2018. It was a very tumultuous period over there, so I kind of got to see the security infrastructure dissolve a little bit. And was over there before that pivotal moment that we all saw on television. That was really heartbreaking in my eyes. And then I deployed to East Africa. So I've had a wide-ranging experience in the military. I loved it. And, there's a lot of service members from Houston County, so I'm proud to be one of them.
That is amazing, and I know I've always been proud to call you my cousin. So now you are something special in East Africa. What was that story again? What are you considered?
Yeah, so I made the rank of major while I was overseas. So I got, before we went, our team got to compete, and our team was, kind of ranked the number one team in the unit. So we got to choose where we wanted to deploy, and we chose Somalia. So initially, we did not get to go into Somalia. We were in Djibouti, which is kind of a staging area to go into Somalia, and we have some pretty built-up infrastructure there. Um, and that's a very strategically important place in the world, and we can go into that if you want. But um, I was working with this colonel on the Djiboutian Somali border, and when I made the rank of major, they threw like a ceremony for me. I asked him to promote me, so I got some really good pictures of a foreign colonel in Africa promoting me to major. And then he said, "We have another gift for you." And I was like, "Interesting. Well, what's the gift?" So they bring me to a thatch hut. They kind of take off all my clothing, and then they adorn me with African tribal accoutrements and gear. So I'm wearing a traditional African dress. I have a, a stick they gave me. I have a comb in my hair, and I don't know. It was a wild experience. And they put me on a camel and paraded me through a village. And he said, "You're now an elder of my village." And then we had a kind of a ceremony where he cooked a fantastic goat. And that's kind of a big deal because, they don't, food is somewhat scarce. So it was an enjoyable experience. It was a unique experience. And, that's one of those experiences that you can only get from serving. So it was an adventure.
That is interesting. I never would have thought you would have grown up to be an elder,
Of
an
Africa,
African
yeah.
elder. That's
Yep.
that's pretty cool.
What's funny is, you never know when those relationships will pay off or those type of stories will pay off.
Yeah.
In school, there was an Ethiopian gentleman, and I immediately recognized him from being from the region. And I told him my story, and he didn't believe me. And then, of course, I showed him some pictures and everything, and he's like, "That's unbelievable." So, I've made several attempts to have, Ethiopian coffee with him,
Yeah.
and just because it's the continuation of that experience, I guess.
Yeah. That's cool. So Somalia, East Africa. I mean, I don't. That's not a place of the world that I think about. So why should I think about East Africa? Why does the United States consider that to be a strategically important part of the world?
Well, it's interesting is there's only one foreign base that China has. It's in Djibouti, Africa. There's only one foreign base that the Japanese military has. It's in Djibouti, Africa, and it's because of the Suez Canal and the trade route in that area. If you follow the border of Africa from Somalia into Djibouti up to the canal, I think I read where 15% of all global trade goes through that daily. So, it's
Wow.
just it may be one of the most important strategic locations in the world. And, you know, so if you're thinking, well, why should I care? Why should America have influence there? And,
Mm,
this was a point of contention recently because I believe Trump was very adamant about not wanting to be involved with Africa at all
mm,
from a
mm.
political standpoint and a strategic standpoint. But it's one of those questions where I think it's always important to put in context, and just ask basic questions of what is the alternative. If
Yeah.
America was not there influencing that major trade route, is there a power vacuum? Who takes control? Certainly, China is poised to take control of that area if we were not present. So, generally speaking, it's something that I don't think the average American citizen, even though they might not see it play out in their day-to-day lives, that's not an area we want to lose influence over.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Interesting. Interesting. So I know at one of the changing the topics a little bit to Ukraine, and then of course I'd love to get your thoughts on Israel as well, and how that relates to people in Alabama, or why it should or why it shouldn't matter. But we had conversations. I think we traded a lot of text in the run up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now I remember uh, your opinion at the time was that the Ukrainians certainly didn't have a chance. It was going to be a cakewalk for Russia. But in all fairness, I think most people, including myself, including a lot of people in the U.S. government, probably saw that was probably going to be I guess, the most likely result. Why do you think? And we'll touch on why Ukraine should or shouldn't matter. But why do you think Ukraine has been able to withstand the Russian invasion, to the surprise of yourself, myself, and a lot of folks?
Yeah, I'll preface what I'm saying with I'm by no means a strategic expert on
Yeah,
anything. I'm just a person who served this country, had unique and interesting experiences, and understands armored warfare, which is what has played out in the first phase of this war, and some of the weapon systems that can counterdict the armor movement. And my initial statement was Ukraine doesn't have a chance as long as there's not international cooperation. But the but we have intervened, and we've given tremendous amount of weapons and aid packages. And I think it was an underestimation of Russia's part. They tried to go immediately into Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, and I think they underestimated modern warfare. They underestimated modern weapon systems, and it was a really, really bloody opening to that war because we were basically able to, and I say we as a Western alliance, I guess, able to stop their penetration into the Ukrainian territory with something like a Javelin missile system. A Javelin missile system is an incredibly powerful missile system, and it tears apart those T-72s that Russia's using going into Ukraine. So you with very minimal training, you give a modern weapon to the hands of a Ukrainian soldier, and all of a sudden there's whole battalions, whole brigades getting taken out. And of course, of the way that the Russian military works from a very top-down, orders-driven thing. In the American military, we have something called mission command. And this played itself out in World War II, and it plays itself out in a lot of different places in how we function. But it's basically like, the lowest commander on the ground has authority as long as he's following the intent, he's getting to the end state. He can make things happen independently in most cases. Well, that's not the way Russia works. Russia works from a very top-down environment. A lot of foreign militaries do, just because of the way they train and other things. So at the end of the day, at the beginning of the war, you saw a tremendous amount of Russian generals dying because they had to send their generals down to the front lines to direct things because they just didn't have the same capability and functioning that we do. So, when you say, why should an average American care or somebody from Houston County care about the war? I think you have to go back in history and kind of look at the context of why we are the way we are. You have to look at the creation of NATO. So when you go back into the 1940s, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement. That was the establishment of the dollar as the world reserve currency, the establishment of the International Monetary Fund. So what did that do for us? That gave us incredible global power. It gave us incredible leverage economically, the ability to impose sanctions in certain cases. And then shortly after that, what do we have? We had the Potsdam Conference where, the Soviet Union, the US, Great Britain, we sat down and said, how are we going to divvy up Germany post-war? And we created the UN, we created NATO from that conference, and you move forward in time. And I think when you look at the generational support for these different wars, you see like most generations, okay, something should be done about Russia. There shouldn't be no intervention. So you're just like 60%. And then you move down to the Generation X, Generation Z, millennials, and it falls below 50%. And I think what's going on there is there's a loss of historical context. And we are where we are in the world because of those two conferences, and people can go read about them and get more historical detail and nuance from that. But then you say, well, why should we work with a country like Ukraine? They're obviously corrupt. Well, Ukraine is a corrupt country. And my whole thing is when people make that argument, I always say, well, what's the alternative? Is the alternative to do nothing? I think Russia had sort of an existential crisis when we were debating adding Ukraine to NATO, and it caused a lot of internal tensions within their calculus. And certainly Putin seems to be at the end of his life spectrum, so he's thinking, what is my legacy going to be? So let's take back that Donbass region that is on the eastern side of Ukraine. But if we make all of our decisions through the prism of, well, this country is not corrupt, this country is corrupt, well, I don't think we'd be working with anyone in the world.
Yeah, we won't work with ourselves if that's the case. I mean, you go to Washington
Exactly.
D.C. That's probably one of the most corrupt places on the planet.
Right. So there's corruption everywhere.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the right litmus test to say whether we should be involved with a country or not.
Yeah.
So in essence, I mean, the aid packages, all these aid packages, they don't go directly to Ukraine. So I don't know if it's directly funding corruption, but it does go to the military industrial complex. They do spin up the production of certain weapon systems. They do send them over. And so far, it's had a fantastic effect. Russia has been stopped stone cold. But one thing I think people need to keep in context is, as the United States, we were at war for 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we lost less than 10,000 men. They've been in this war for 2 years, and the last estimate I read is 500,000 loss of life. That's
for Ukraine or for both? For both belligerents
combined.
Both belligerents. Wow.
And so I think that is modern warfare at its most brutal. You know what I mean? We're watching that play out, and it is a nasty, nasty thing. So, but my last point, I guess, to that is, what's the alternative? Is the alternative to let Russia sit on NATO's doorstep? I don't necessarily think that should be the case when we can basically attrit the Russian military and make them, non-operational for the next 50 years by simply giving weapon systems, which is a fraction of our total DoD budget. So when you take all the things into perspective, I understand some of the arguments that are made of why people don't want to be involved. But I think, in terms of bang for buck, this is a great situation for the U.S. to delegitimize Russia's authority in the world.
Yeah. That's interesting. You talked about modern war and the brutality. I'm reminded of an audiobook I listened to. I think it was called Black Sun, and it details the making of the atomic bomb. I've always been very interested in atomic history for whatever reason, even though I'm not a physicist, not a chemist, not a scientist, but for some reason that fascinates me. And there's a passage in there that it talks about warfare, and I'm not going to do it justice. You have to go back and listen to the audiobook or read it. It talks about how war is a machine, and the fuel for the machine is essentially human flesh. And initially it's the flesh of soldiers, it's the flesh of our youth that we send into war. But with the creation of the atomic bomb, the machine becomes hungrier and hungrier, and it consumes buildings, it consumes cities, it consumes civilians. It just consumes everything, and it's a very, very poignant passage. And I highlight that's one of the best. Matter of fact, that is the best nonfiction book I've ever read or listened to in an audiobook format. But so, um, let's talk about Israel. And again, I know you said you're not a strategic expert, but I guess compared to me, you're a strategic expert. So that's why I'm talking to you. It's been this has been. I guess this is one of the scarier parts, scarier things I've witnessed. I was looking on Facebook this morning. Probably a bad habit. I get up and I check my social media. But there was a person from, I'm not going to say where, but a local person that was, making a lot of posts that were clearly pro-Hamas. I mean, it was comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, and I was just very disturbed by that. And I didn't comment, but I find that whole line of thought disturbing. And of course, we see that it's on our college campuses. We see that it's on, in some of the bluer cities. I guess give me your thoughts on the Israeli Palestinian conflict.
Well, I think, again, I think it's like lack of historical context in a lot of cases where people are viewing these things. They don't separate Hamas out from the Palestinian people. There is a
Yeah,
difference. Hamas is a terrorist organization. And, you know, you know, you can debate all day long whether Israel, has had some negative consequences for how they treated different areas of the Gaza Strip or the Palestinian people. And I'm sure some of that's legitimate, but you can't argue for Hamas. Hamas is not in any sort of ideological spectrum that is to be cheered or celebrated. Um,
I agree. I agree.
right. And then, even in my own, tying that back to my personal service, like, I saw ISIS operate in Afghanistan. I saw the Taliban operate in Afghanistan, which we don't consider the Taliban a terrorist organization per se, but they certainly use terror tactics to achieve their ends through the Haqqani network at the time. And then I saw, what Al-Shabaab was doing in East Africa. And the thing about all these terrorist groups is, you know, they have a different worldview than the Western Alliance and democracy. And they typically fester and grow in places that have low education rates, that are in desolate areas, have poor economics to them. So I, anybody who's taking a public stance pro-Hamas, I think if they actually peeled back the onion and just simply looked at the facts and separated the Palestinian people from the terror network that is Hamas, they would probably change their opinion pretty quickly. But
Yeah,
but but in terms of America's, involvement even in that, why should the average American care? Well, at the end of the day, Israel is simply just a democracy, and it's a projection of American power, and it goes back to that global apparatus we've established. And I tend to make the argument of that global apparatus that we've established has led to incredible stability worldwide. When you look after the conferences I mentioned, after Korea, Vietnam, I think we've had a relatively stable period in world history
yeah,
where you see literation. I mean, I think I have some numbers pulled up right here just from what that period entails, and that is a direct result of American influence and stability all over the world, particularly for the fact that we, you know, uh, guard and control the world's waterways through our Navy, which is extremely powerful. But extreme poverty, you know, 36% in the 80s, down to under 10% 7 years ago. So I'm sure it's under even closer to, single digits now. Life expectancy, 46 years old in 1950. It's 73 years old in 2020 worldwide. Child mortality plummeted. Education rates skyrocketed. Violent crime plummeted. World wars and generally conflicts all over the world plummeted compared to the 20th century. The 20th century was an incredibly brutal and bloody century. But what have we had over the last 60, 70 years? A period that has seen less dictatorship, more democracy, and, yes, there's been war, but when you compare it to World War I, World War II, and some of the internal things that went on in the Soviet Union and China pre-1960, it doesn't compare. So I think, going back to taking just asking the question, why are we where we are around the world? Why do we support countries like Israel? And what are the consequences if we don't? If you sit there and said, well, we shouldn't have any influence with what Israel is doing right now and back them as they attempt to eradicate Hamas, well, what does that mean for Iran? Do they become emboldened by that? They're sitting on top of a nuclear weapon or about to sit on top of a nuclear weapon. I think that would be incredibly damaging. And it would really, I think you would see American influence dissipate very quickly. And all of that stability. And, if you're a poor person in the United States, you're still in the top 1% of the world in terms of wealth. And that's hard.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. It's hard for people to contextualize. It's hard for people to think, well, what is the historical context of all this and how does it lead to the stability of my own life? And as soon as you start taking that stuff for granted and the security apparatus that we put in place all over the world, and one domino falls, then another domino falls, I think you would have incredibly negative consequences.
Yeah.
And it would start with our economy.
There's a lot of people, or I guess a lot of nation states that are actively trying to pull down that apparatus that you've talked about that we've constructed. I mean, obviously China is becoming more emboldened. Russia, I don't know if you could classify the war, their misadventure in Ukraine as being emboldened or being desperate. I would, there's probably some truth to both. You've got the terrorist organizations, just blatantly crossing over the border into Israel, beheading children, kidnapping women. I saw with the German lady that was at the music festival. I think a lot of us have seen photos of her. Has kind of long, I don't know if you call them dreads or braided hair. They found her, I guess they found her body and her head, and they were found in two different locations. But just
Well,
going back to what you were saying earlier, just brutal. But you have all these people
yeah.
trying to chip away, and what do you, I guess, what do you think the future holds, or what are your thoughts there?
Well, in terms of well, if I could just comment on one thing you just said about
Yeah.
Israel, is, that was the equivalent of 4 9/11s for them in terms of per capita death. And this is
I've
by
heard
far,
that. Yeah.
yeah. So when you talk about this from a historical context and the way they view it, I mean, it's easy to watch things on TV and say, well, what is the significance of this? Well, that kind of puts it into some perspective, I think.
Yeah. For
But,
Americans.
you don't have to go back too far in history to look at the Yom Kippur War. And in 4 days, you've already reached half civilian deaths of what that war was. And that was one of the largest armored battles in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And that was nation states acting on a nation state. This is a gang, I guess you could say, or an element of terrorism with very little numbers going in and causing a massive amount of death.
Yeah.
So, and people say, well, how can the security apparatus of that fail? How can the intelligence fail? I think it's very easy. When you have a densely populated area like where the Palestinians live in the Gaza Strip, things always, and you have an intelligence apparatus that you may become over reliant on. Well, things always go on in the dark. I mean,
Yeah.
I saw that firsthand in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Djibouti. The intelligence isn't infallible, and it's easy to get complacent and things of that nature. So, It's not a conspiracy. It's just a reality of modern warfare and how we're interacting with the world. But in terms of tearing down the global security apparatus, I think you see elements of both Trump and Biden, and I think it's really due to the nature of our economy, where we're kind of deglobalizing. We're becoming more reliant on ourselves, and I don't know what the implications of that are. I mean, we could speculate, and part of that is we're the only country in the world, I think, and different people might make different arguments, but there are a lot of people who I think would echo what I'm saying, and I'm echoing other people who are much more experienced in thinking about these things than I am. We're the only country in the world that is innovating into the fourth industrial revolution.
Talk
That's
about that.
incredible.
You mentioned that earlier. What is the fourth industrial revolution? Because you're talking about things that I don't think about on a daily basis. What is that?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, at the end of the day, it's just the synergy between robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, and computing power. So you see the rise of recently, I think, that everybody kind of tunes into is large language models. Um, but certainly when you think about, I mean, that it's a complex question, but when you think about just the synergistic nature of the things I just mentioned and the software that it takes to do that, and I know you know firsthand about software and software development to an extent, you know, you have to have incredibly intelligent people doing that. And we're the only country in the world that's doing it. There might be some one-off companies in Europe, but Europe as a whole is not innovating to the fourth industrial revolution. Asia, I don't think is. So as we become more deeper into that, what I call kind of a parabolic change of technological advancement. And side note, I guess, I am at UNC in business school studying tech and innovation management. So it is a topic that I guess I'm reading about pretty often recently. But, um, when you compare where we're going versus previous industrial revolutions, like look at the second industrial revolution, that was a 100-year stabilization period. So humans are great at thinking linearly, but we're very poor at thinking non-linearly. And the fourth industrial revolution is a non-linear movement in technological advancement. So, for example, as we become, why do we rely on China right now? Well, we rely on China for, different microchips, maybe in Taiwan, maybe Asia has a large role in that. Well, when we can do that on our own, when we can start automating some of these manufacturing processes and bring them back home, and now we're not relying on China. Well, it seems to me that we're kind of fragmenting into a multipolar world, kind of pre-World War II, kind of pre those conferences that we're talking about.
That's the way it
How that
seems to be
plays out,
lining
I don't
up.
know.
Yeah.
Say again?
It seems to be lining up that way. You've got the West, the collective West, which would include the United States and most of Europe, and then you've got, I don't know, is it everybody else? Is it China and Russia and the Arab states and some of South America? Who knows where India is going to land? India, to me, is an interesting player. They seem
Yes.
to be a lot like, and this may be completely incorrect, but they seem to be a lot like. Switzerland. They just they're not interested in being engaged in conflicts or wars. Everybody else, you handle your differences. We're just going to do business with everybody, and it'll be interesting to see, if there is another big one, another world war. Do they pick a side, and whose side do they pick? I know they've had some kinetic action with China. I think there's a disputed border in the northern parts of India. So the Indians and the Chinese don't exactly have the best relationship, but they seem to be cozying up to them a little bit more lately. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'm typically like negative on China and long on India. I
Gotcha.
mean, in really, you could say universities all across America, but particularly right here at UNC, this is somewhat of a tough business school to get into, and we're 50%, maybe 40% international. And the Indian population here is incredibly intelligent. So and that goes back to our discussion, America is fantastic at recruiting the best talent in the world. Because if you're an incredibly intelligent person who lives in India, well, where do you want to go? You want to go to America to, potentially get involved in what we were just discussing in terms of software development, aiding into that fourth industrial revolution. So the other thing about India is it has fantastic demographics. I think India, when you look at how you want demographics to be in a country for long-term success, You want a pyramid structure. You want very few older people at the top and a broad base of younger people at the bottom of that pyramid. And if I'm not mistaken, I know Mexico probably leads the world in terms of perfect demographics. If we cut ourselves off from the world and we had Mexico at our side, I think we could go on and probably do great things and be okay and survive. And I think India has pretty healthy demographics in that turn too. Where on the other hand, you have China, who there's a lot of reports that they might have been lying about their demographics over the last 50 years, and they don't have what they, basically a result of Mao Zedong's one-child policy. So
Yeah.
I think generally speaking, like you have to be long on India. They have some incredible, resourceful and intelligent people at the helm, and they're about to be the most populous country in the world. So
I think they are. I think they are. I think I
yeah,
saw
I think they
saw
did. They
that
just
maybe a
crossed it.
couple of months ago. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of the Indians, here in Southeast Alabama, and I'm friends with a lot of them. Um, you know, insanely successful. Vimal
Right.
Patel, a fellow Rotarian of mine, he owns the Econo Lodge here in Dothan, and I think he owns a couple of other hotels, or him and his family. Very interesting guy, and doesn't mind hard work, and doesn't mind putting their capital to use. And I think there's something there for all of us,
Well,
especially me, to learn from.
to back that up with a statistic, the Indian populations who come in here to America, there are more entrepreneurial ventures from Indians than there are nation-born Americans.
Well,
You
that's
know,
crazy.
and
That's crazy.
and there it is crazy. And there's also they're the number one income earner in terms of demographic in the U.S.
Yeah, I think I had read that. I think I had read that.
So incredibly
It's
hardworking
amazing.
people, incredibly intelligent.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. You've talked about technology. I want to change the subject a little bit because we've had some discussions on this.
Hmm.
I want to talk a little bit about UFOs, or I guess what is it, UAPs? Is that the new lingo? I know you've had, because you've had the opportunities that you've had to serve our country in a few different roles. You've kind of seen some things, I guess. Give me your thoughts on UAPs. Like, is this, because I'm sitting here I'm thinking like this is, what would you call this? A double bluff? I think this is American technology, and we're saying it's UFOs or UAPs so we can throw off, the Chinese or the Russians. Is that what it is, or is there some sort of artificial intelligent sentient beings that's traveling to planet Earth? I mean, give me your take on that.
Well, I mean, when I think about this subject, and I thought about it a lot because, you know, when this subject kind of came into the American spectrum where it started hitting the media channels, I'm like, what is
Yeah,
going
it
on
used
here?
to be you had to be a crazy person to believe in
Right,
UFOs, and now like Congress is holding hearings and everybody's
right.
talking about this.
So I think this is the most sensational story of our lifetime, no matter how it plays out at this point. And I'll
Okay,
tell you why.
okay,
You know, number one, let's say that it is our technology. Well, first, let's back up a little bit.
okay.
I have followed since this came out. It became a very interested topic of mine, and I have been exposed while in service to people who may have been exposed to certain things, and they gave me their opinion on it, and it was really bewildering to me. And
Really?
people that I've trusted and have a high opinion of, and then when I started following like different things that had become declassified, I read into them and kind of followed the story along, and then I sought out some of these people these intelligence officials, and some of these people were very high ranking on the Navy or Army side. And I
Wow.
said, what is going on? I'm just a curious citizen, but I find
Yeah.
this topic fascinating. What is going on? And a lot of these individuals have come back to me and said, there's absolutely something going on, and we don't understand what it is. So I kind
Really?
of take a look at this as a very sobering way of this is a great mystery. There are things flying around that we don't understand. This is
Yeah.
not me saying that. That's head of CIA, head of
Yeah.
DIA, head of, different presidents have said that. And then you have these, military officials who in private are telling me like, yeah, there is something going on here and it is bewildering. And there's some sort of technology exhibiting itself in a way that we don't understand. So at this point, when you think about that, and by the way, I think the best, if people wanted to research this on their own and say, well, what is going on here? The Nimitz incident, And this happened, I think, in the early
That's the one
2000s.
they refer to as the Tic Tac. Is that the
Yeah,
same
I think
one?
that's probably the most recorded,
Okay.
uh, sensor detected, visual, everything. You can go and probably watch some random YouTube video on that with
Yeah.
some of these commanders that were flying the jets and get their take on it. But at the end of the day, the reason it's the most sensational story, in my opinion, is because let's say that it is our technology. Well, that means we've had some sort of generational technological breakthrough where we have these things flying around that can go into space, go underwater, go multi kilometers away in a matter of seconds,
Yeah.
change direction on a dime, no propulsion. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And let's
Yeah.
say that it is a intelligent psyop. I guess that's a possibility. I mean, that would be incredibly damning of our intelligence community, but I don't think anybody would be surprised if that's the case. Whether it's
Yeah.
some sort of psyop, we're trying to say that we have a technology that maybe we don't have. We're somehow manifesting it and trying to put a fear into adversary's mind.
Yeah.
To me, that's one of the biggest stories of our lifetime.
Yeah.
And then you could go down the list. If it ends up being some sort of interdimensional, actual uh, non-human source, of course, that's probably the biggest story of humanity.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, what if it's just these intelligence officials that have been going forward, having classified hearings with Congress, supposedly giving them direct evidence after 20 hours of testimony? Well, that means we have crazy people with the highest security clearances, and they've
So,
just gone nuts. So
yeah.
that's sensational in and of itself.
So either way you look at it, this is just the whole thing is nuts. The whole
Well,
thing's crazy.
well, as soon as these intelligence officials gave under oath testimony in a classified setting, you kind of crossed the Rubicon on that to
Yeah.
where now
Yeah.
the outcome is it has to be sensational no matter what.
Yeah, yeah. I
So,
guess I've never thought about it that way, but that's interesting. There, I think Elon Musk subscribes to this theory, and I think physicists have actually looked into this. Like, there's a fairly decent chance, according to physicists, that we live in this grand simulation. And are UFOs just a glitch in the matrix? I don't know. It's I guess it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I tell you what, if the person that's if we just live in some massively multi-played online role playing game, that whoever's controlling me needs to get off their butt and get to work, so, because they'll open. But I was reading the other day and I screenshotted this, and I can't pick up my phone and show it to you, but I'll send it to you after this. When what was that guy, Mikhail Gorbachev? He flew in during the '80s, I guess in the '80s, and visited with President Ronald Reagan, and they were talking. I can't remember what the conference was about. That wasn't the point of the article, but anyway, they decided to go for a walk, and it was just the two of them, and an interpreter,
yep.
and their I guess their entourages did not join them on this walk, and there was this question, I guess, for a number of years, like, what did they talk about? They didn't really say, and I think it was the interpreter or somebody come forward years and years later, and this is what I was reading, is that the topic of discussion was Reagan turned to Gorbachev and said, if we were ever invaded by aliens, do you think we could put aside our differences and work together? And anyway, I thought about you, and I thought that was an interesting story. But
No, it is
anyway,
interesting. And Reagan had his own UFO experience where he goes, if you read his memoirs, he goes in depth talking about an experience where he was on an airplane and he saw something and asked the pilot to turn around and go view it again. And
uh,
he was a big believer in UFOs and thought there was
really.
something out there because of not only intelligence reports he had been receiving in different military reports that he had been
Yeah,
receiving, but also from his personal experience. So interesting,
interesting.
interesting topic.
You have to send me that link to the memoir. I have to pick that up, and we'll share it on the podcast notes. So um, I guess closing thoughts. We've touched on this a little bit. In your experience, and you've admitted a limited experience, but certainly much more substantial worldly experience than I've had. If you had to make a prediction on how things end up in the Middle East or how things end up in Ukraine, and how long it takes for us to get there, and any other topics that you want to make predictions on, where do you think we go from here?
Very complicated question. it's I would say it's, anything going on with Ukraine and Russia is going to be a long, drawn out conflict.
Okay.
It's just going to be a bloodbath, unfortunately. I wouldn't be surprised if, we wake up 5 years from now and the number is 1 million people
Wow.
that have unfortunately died as a result of this conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in terms of Israel Hamas, you know, America just got out of 20 years of conducting counterinsurgencies and things of that nature. When Israel goes into these different areas to root out Hamas, it will not be easy. It will be long. It will be drawn out. And, I imagine that we'll be reading about military operations going on to this end 3 years from now.
Wow.
None of these things will have a quick end. So, unfortunately, I guess to your, the nonfiction thing that you referenced earlier, once you start going down these routes of warfare, it kind of builds, feeds, and chews on itself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've seen some of that firsthand, unfortunately, and I don't think these conflicts will be any different. But
Yeah.
I think the bigger thing is hoping that it doesn't, in both situations, develop into some broader conflict, and we keep it isolated. And it's a tepid situation. Like if you're president, no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're not going to win any points because no matter what you do is going to be perceived as weak in one ideological spectrum, as we live in a kind of a binary ideological political environment. So I have to imagine that the current president is not happy that all this stuff is popping up on his watch because, it's so there's always an argument to be made that something else can be done or it happened because of X, Y, Z, and maybe there's truth to that, maybe there's not, but long conflicts.
Yeah. That's sad, and the loss of life. I mean, just families. Whole entire families cut short. I think I read something today where a family of Ukrainians were massacred by Russian soldiers because they didn't want the Russian soldiers quartering in their house. I think it was
Of course,
11 or so people killed. But Stetson, always good to see you. We
yeah,
always have the most interesting conversations. I've said this to other people. You are probably the most interesting person in the world, at least that I've ever met. So
well, I'm glad
glad
you
to have
think
you.
so.
Yeah, I do.
You might be the only one, but
Well, I don't
well,
think so. I don't think so. Didn't you have a card that said you were the most interesting man in the world at some point? A business card
well, that my
that
last
that
business
somebody
card,
gave you?
yeah, the owners put Memu on it. That's your role in this company. Be the most interesting you can be and go make things happen. But I don't know. From a distance, I've enjoyed watching you, you know, in the role that you're in. I enjoyed watching you campaign. I think you're doing a great job. I'm a product of the area, so I always like to stay in touch with what's going on.
Yeah.
And I wish you the best of luck. And, I always have, no matter where I'm at, I always think about the people of Houston County to some degree. Because, if that's where you're from, you're always going to be beholden to that in some way. So keep up the great work. I think you have fantastic political capital and your political future is bright in more ways than the current role you're serving. So good luck to you.
Well, I appreciate that. We'll see what the future holds. But this is the Red State Rundown. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, I hope you'll give us a subscribe. That way you can get future episodes. And we'll be sure to have Stetson Kornegay back on at a future date. Stetson, again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.